It was just another Tuesday morning for Zora Mbeki, early, humid, and packed with the kind of quiet urgency that only comes when you're balancing a dozen responsibilities and trying not to drop any of them. She stood near Gate B14 at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, one hand wrapped around a travel mug of ginger tea, the other scrolling through last-minute notes on her tablet. Her flight to Denver wasn't glamorous, but it mattered. In 2 days, she'd be finalizing a partnership that could bring solar-powered microgrids to 3 underserved communities in rural Mississippi. For Zora, this wasn't just a job. It was the reason she'd stayed up late rewriting grant proposals and spent weekends talking to local leaders over shaky Zoom calls. She believed deeply that clean energy shouldn't be a luxury reserved for certain zip codes. She'd earned her window seat the old-fashioned way, through years of loyalty, countless red-eyes and miles racked up flying between conferences, site visits, and family emergencies. Today, that seat 14A was more than a spot on a plane. It was a small reward for showing up again and again, even when no one was watching. She liked the window because it gave her a moment of stillness. Up there, above the clouds, the world felt simpler. No emails, no expectations, just sky and silence. Boarding began right on time. Zora waited patiently in Zone 2, watching families shuffle forward with overstuffed backpacks and business travelers tap impatiently on their phones. She smiled at a little boy clutching a stuffed owl and nodded to an older woman struggling with a rolling suitcase. These tiny human moments were the glue that held her faith in people together, especially on days when the news felt heavy. She found her seat easily, stowed her bag, and settled in with the ease of someone who'd done this 100 times before. She slipped on her noise-canceling headphones, queued up a playlist of ambient jazz, and sipped her tea. Outside, ground crew moved with practiced rhythm. The cabin hummed softly as passengers filled the rows. Everything felt normal, predictable even. Then, about 20 minutes before departure, things shifted. A flight attendant approached, tall, polished, with a name tag that read D. Calloway. Her smile was bright, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good morning," she said, voice smooth like rehearsed customer service script. "We've had a last-minute upgrade request from a VIP passenger. Would you be willing to switch to 23B? It's just 2 rows back, still a window seat." Zora looked up, polite but cautious. She'd heard that phrase before, VIP passenger. It usually meant someone with status, connections, or simply the kind of presence that made staff bend rules without asking why. She glanced toward first class. There, already seated in 2A despite holding an economy boarding pass, was a woman in a cream linen suit, diamond studs catching the cabin light, calmly flipping through a glossy magazine. She hadn't asked Zora herself. She hadn't even looked in her direction. But the request was clear. Move so she doesn't have to. Zora took a slow breath. "I appreciate the offer," she said evenly, "but I paid for this seat with miles I've saved over years. I'd really prefer to stay." Calloway's smile tightened just slightly. "It's just a seat, ma'am. We're trying to accommodate a very important guest." The words landed like a stone. Just a seat, as if comfort, dignity, and fairness were interchangeable commodities to be shuffled around based on who looked more important. Zora kept her voice calm. "I understand you're trying to help your passenger. But I'm a passenger too, and I'd like to keep the seat I was assigned." For a moment, Calloway said nothing. Then she gave a curt nod and walked away. Zora exhaled, hoping that was the end of it. She adjusted her headphones, tried to refocus on her music. But a few minutes later, Calloway returned, this time with 2 other crew members. One stood near the galley, arms crossed. The other hovered by the aisle, watching. "Ma'am," Calloway said, voice lower now, less friendly, "we really need you to move. We can't have delays over something this minor." Zora sat up straighter. "It's not minor to me." A few nearby passengers glanced over. Someone shifted in their seat. The air in the cabin grew thick with unspoken tension. No one spoke up. No one offered support. But Zora saw it. The flicker of discomfort in their eyes, the way some looked down at their laps, suddenly very interested in nothing at all. Calloway leaned in slightly. "Look, if you don't move voluntarily, we may have to ask you to deplane." "Is that what you want?" The threat hung in the air, quiet but unmistakable. Zora knew how these scenes played out. She'd seen videos, read stories, black travelers labeled disruptive for simply asserting their rights. She also knew that arguing further might escalate things in a way that wouldn't end well for her, no matter how right she was. So she made a choice, not out of agreement, but out of survival. She unbuckled her seatbelt, stood slowly and gathered her things. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't waver. But inside, something hardened as she walked back to 23B, a seat that felt smaller, stuffier. Farther from the emergency exit she preferred, she noticed a man in 22C watching her with quiet concern. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. Later, she'd learn his name was Elias, and that he'd recorded the entire exchange on his phone just in case. Zora sat down, placed her tea in the cup holder, and stared out the window. The plane hadn't even pushed back from the gate yet, but she already felt exhausted. Not from the walk, not from the seat change, but from the weight of having to prove once again that she belonged. She thought about the communities she was flying to help, places where people fought daily for basic resources, for respect, for a fair shot. And here she was on a $300 million aircraft, being treated like an inconvenience for wanting what she'd already earned. But Zora wasn't the type to stew in silence. Before the cabin doors closed, before the flight attendants gave their safety demonstration, she pulled out her phone. She didn't post on social media. She didn't yell or make a scene. Instead, she dialed a number she knew by heart. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Zora, everything okay?" "Not really," Zora said, her voice steady but low. "I just got asked to give up my seat for a white passenger who didn't pay for an upgrade. When I said no, 3 crew members pressured me until I moved. I have witnesses, and I think someone filmed it." There was a pause on the other end, just a beat, but Zora could hear the shift, the click of focus snapping into place. "Stay on the plane if you can," the voice said. "Don't delete anything. I'll call you back in 5. Zora ended the call and placed her phone face down on her tray table. Outside, the tug of the jet bridge detached with a soft thud. Engines rumbled to life. The plane began to taxi. She closed her eyes not to sleep but to center herself. She wasn't angry, not in the loud, fiery way people expected. She was clear about what had happened, clear about what needed to happen next, because this wasn't just about a seat. It was about who gets to decide whose comfort matters, and for too long, that decision had been made without people like her in the room. As the wheels lifted off the tarmac and Atlanta shrank beneath her, Zora made a silent promise. This time she wouldn't let it go unnoticed. Not because she wanted attention, but because someone else shouldn't have to go through this tomorrow. The flight attendant walked down the aisle, offering drinks with a practiced smile. When she reached Zora, she paused as if sensing something had changed. Zora looked up, met her eyes, and said quietly, "Water, please." The attendant handed her a cup without a word, and in that small exchange, Zora felt it, the first ripple of something bigger beginning to move. The plane climbed steadily into the sky, Atlanta's sprawl fading into patchwork greens and grays below. Inside, the cabin settled into that familiar mid-flight rhythm, seatbelts clicking off, tray tables unfolding, the low murmur of conversation mixing with the hum of engines. Most passengers relaxed, but Zora Mbeki stayed still, her hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the clouds. She wasn't thinking about the solar project anymore. Her mind was on the call she just made, and the woman on the other end of the line. Nia Okoro had been Zora's closest friend since their freshman year at Spelman, when they'd bonded over late-night study sessions and shared frustration with campus bureaucracy that never seemed to listen to black students. Now, 15 years later, Nia was general counsel for one of the country's most respected civil rights organizations. She didn't do outrage. She did strategy. And Zora knew that if anyone could turn this moment into something meaningful, it was her. Back on the ground, Nia didn't waste a second. The moment she hung up, she opened her laptop, pulled up the airline's corporate contact list, and started making calls. First, she reached the airline's head of customer experience, a woman she'd met at a policy summit 2 years earlier. Then she dialed the Department of Transportation's Civil Rights Division. Finally, she texted a journalist she trusted, someone known for careful, fact-based reporting rather than viral sensationalism. "Got something serious," she wrote. "Passenger pressured to give up her seat for a white traveler. Crew involved. Video may exist. Can you hold for an hour while I verify?" While Nia worked, Zora tried to focus on her breathing. She sipped her water, ignored the snack cart, and watched the sunlight glint off the wing. She thought about her grandmother, who'd once told her, "When they try to shrink you, stand taller, not louder." That advice had carried her through job interviews where she was the only black woman in the room, through meetings where her ideas were ignored until repeated by someone else. Today she hadn't shouted. She hadn't cried. She'd simply said no, and that in itself had been enough to unsettle the whole system. 2 hours into the flight, her phone buzzed in airplane mode. A text from Naya, sent before takeoff but only now visible. "Stay calm. I've got eyes on this. Don't engage further. Save all evidence." Zora exhaled. She wasn't alone. When the plane touched down in Denver, she moved slowly through the terminal, her carry-on slung over one shoulder. She didn't rush. She didn't look back. But as she passed a newsstand, she caught a glimpse of her own reflection in the glass. Tired eyes, tight shoulders, and realized how much emotional labor she'd just carried through the sky. At baggage claim, she powered on her phone fully. Notifications flooded in. Nia had called twice. Elias, the man from 22C, had sent a message through a mutual contact. "I have the video. It's clear. Let me know what you'd like to do." Zora texted him back, "Thank you. Please hold on to it for now." She took an Uber to her hotel, checked in without speaking much, and went straight to her room. Only then did she let herself sit on the edge of the bed and feel the full weight of what had happened. It wasn't just the injustice, it was the exhaustion of having to navigate it while staying professional, reasonable, non-threatening. She'd done everything right, and still, she'd been treated like a problem to be managed. But before the frustration could settle too deep, her phone rang again. "Nia, you okay?" Nia asked, voice warm but urgent. "I'm here," Zora said. "Tired but here. Good, because things are moving fast. The airline's PR team reached out within 20 minutes of my first call. They're scared, and they should be." Nia explained that the Department of Transportation had opened a preliminary inquiry. The journalist was preparing a short piece for the evening news cycle, and Elias had already shared the video with Naya's legal team. It showed Calloway saying, "We can't have disruptions over something so minor," while the white passenger sat comfortably in first class, untouched by the drama unfolding behind her. "They're offering you a full refund, lifetime elite status, and a personal apology from the CEO," Nia said. "But I told them that's not the point." "What did you ask for?" Zora said. "Transparency, accountability, and a policy change that prevents this from happening to anyone else." Zora nodded, even though Nia couldn't see her. "That's all I want." Over the next few hours, Zora gave a formal statement to Nia's legal team. She described every detail, the tone of Calloway's voice, the body language of the other crew members, the silence of the passengers around her. She didn't exaggerate. She didn't dramatize. She just told the truth as clearly as she could. Meanwhile, Elias posted the video online, not on a major platform, but on a community journalism site known for ethical reporting. He included a short caption. "This happened on Flight 287 today. The woman asked to move is Zora Mbeki. She did nothing wrong." Within an hour, the clip had been shared thousands of times. Comments poured in, some angry, some supportive, some sharing their own stories of being asked to move for someone more important. A retired flight attendant wrote, "This has been happening for decades. They always pick the quiet ones, the ones who won't make a scene." By evening, Wiener's seat for sale was trending, not because Zora had started it, but because people recognized the pattern. It wasn't just about one flight. It was about who gets treated as disposable in service of someone else's comfort. Zora watched the conversation unfold from her hotel room, wrapped in a thin blanket, eating room service pasta she didn't really taste. She felt strange, exposed, yet strangely calm. She hadn't wanted to become a symbol. She just wanted to keep her seat. But now that the story was out, she knew she had a responsibility to see it through. Late that night, the airline's CEO called her personally. His voice was apologetic, almost trembling. "Ms. Mbeki, I'm so deeply sorry for what you experienced. This does not reflect our values. We are taking immediate action." Zora listened quietly. Then she said, "I believe you mean well, but apologies don't change systems. What are you actually going to do?" The CEO paused. Then he outlined a plan: internal investigation, retraining for all customer-facing staff, and a review of seat reassignment protocols. He also confirmed that the 3 crew members had been suspended pending review. That's a start, Zora said. But suspension isn't accountability. People need to know this behavior has consequences. She hung up not with anger but with resolve. She wasn't trying to destroy anyone's career, but she also wouldn't let this be swept under the rug with a voucher and a press release. The next morning, she woke early, showered, and dressed for her meeting with the clean energy partners. She almost canceled. Part of her wanted to stay in bed to process everything, but she reminded herself why she was here. Those communities in Mississippi didn't care about airline scandals. They cared about lights that stayed on during storms, about clinics that could refrigerate medicine, about kids who could study after dark, and she owed it to them to show up. As she walked into the conference room, her phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from a stranger. "My daughter saw your story."
"She's 12, she said, so she just said no?"
I told her yes. And that's how change starts. Zora read it twice. Then she put her phone away, took a deep breath, and stepped into the room. Later that day, news broke that the airline had upgraded its civil rights compliance team and invited external auditors to review its customer service policies. Civil rights organizations across the country issued statements of support, and quietly, behind the scenes, Nia was negotiating something bigger, a formal partnership between the airline and Zora's nonprofit, focused on equity and green infrastructure. But none of that mattered as much as the quiet certainty Zora felt walking out of that meeting. She hadn't set out to start a movement. She'd just wanted to sit in the seat she'd earned. And in doing so, she'd reminded everyone watching that dignity isn't negotiable, and that sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to move. Zora Mbeki returned to Atlanta 3 days after the flight, not with fanfare or press waiting at the gate, but with the same quiet focus she'd carried onto the plane. Her suitcase wheels clicked softly against the terminal floor as she walked toward baggage claim, her mind already shifting back to grant deadlines, team check-ins, and the next phase of the solar project. The world outside had erupted. News clips played on loop in airport lounges. Strangers tagged her in social media posts, and her inbox overflowed with messages from people she'd never met. But inside, she felt strangely grounded. She hadn't asked for any of this attention, but now that it was here, she was determined not to let it fade into noise. Back at her apartment, she unpacked slowly, folding clothes with the kind of care usually reserved for sacred things. On her kitchen counter sat a small potted succulent her mother had given her years ago. "Something that survives even when you forget it," her mom had said with a wink. Zora watered it now, then opened her laptop. What she saw surprised her. The video Elias had posted had been picked up by a major news outlet. Not in a sensational way, but with careful context. Interviews with former airline staff, quotes from civil rights experts, and a clear timeline of events. The headline read, "When Customer Service Becomes Discrimination." The comments section wasn't perfect. There were the usual trolls, the both sides takes, but far more voices echoed a shared truth. This wasn't about one seat. It was about who gets to be treated like a full human being in public spaces. Then came the emails. One was from a retired flight attendant named Delia, who'd worked for the same airline for 23 years. "We were trained to manage difficult passengers," she wrote. But the definition of difficult always seemed to depend on skin color. "I stayed quiet too long. Thank you for speaking up." Another came from a college student in Detroit. "I'm studying aviation management. After seeing your story, I'm adding a civil rights module to my senior thesis. You made me realize this industry needs more than efficiency. It needs ethics." Zora read each message carefully. She didn't reply to all of them, but she saved the ones that carried weight, the ones that showed someone had truly seen her. Not just the headline. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, the airline was in crisis mode. Internal communications, later leaked, whether by accident or design, no one could prove, revealed that Callaway wasn't acting alone. Supervisors had quietly encouraged flexible seating for high-value passengers. Code, it turned out, for frequent flyers who spent heavily or held corporate accounts. And in nearly every documented case over the past 2 years, the passengers asked to move were black, brown, or visibly working class. The Department of Transportation didn't just open an inquiry. They launched a formal investigation. They subpoenaed training manuals, crew communications, and customer complaint logs. Civil rights groups filed a joint letter demanding systemic reform, not just disciplinary action. Still, the airline's first public response was cautious. "We take all allegations seriously," their statement read. "An internal review is underway." It was the kind of language designed to calm markets. Not people, but the public wasn't buying it. Protesters gathered outside the airline's headquarters, not with signs full of rage, but with photos of passengers holding boarding passes and handwritten notes. "I paid for my seat too." A coalition of black travel bloggers organized a Fly with Dignity campaign, urging travelers to document and report biased treatment. Even some of the airline's own employees began speaking out anonymously, describing a culture where keeping VIPs happy often overrode fairness. Zora watched all of this unfold from her living room, sipping chamomile tea as rain tapped against her window. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a witness. And witnesses, she knew, had a duty to stay present. Then came the call from the CEO, again. This time, his tone was different. Less rehearsed. More human. "Ms. Mbeki," he said, "we've reviewed everything. The pattern is undeniable, and it stops now." He told her they were not only terminating the 3 crew members involved, but also revising their entire customer service protocol. No more discretionary seat reassignments. No more vague definitions of VIP. From now on, upgrades would follow strict, transparent criteria, available to all passengers equally, regardless of appearance or perceived status. Zora listened. "That's a good start," she said. "But what about the people who approved this culture? The managers who looked the other way?" A long pause. Then, "They're under review too." She didn't push further. She knew change in big systems was slow, messy, and rarely perfect. But for the first time, it felt real. The next day, the airline announced the firings, not just of Calloway and her 2 colleagues, but of a regional customer service director who'd signed off on the flexible seating memo. They also pledged to partner with civil rights organizations to rebuild trust, including mandatory anti-bias training co-developed with external experts. Critics called it damage control. Supporters called it accountability. Zora called it necessary, but she also knew the real test wasn't in press releases, it was in the next flight. The next passenger. The next moment, someone was asked to move. Just this once. That evening, she met Nia for dinner at a quiet Ethiopian restaurant they'd loved since college. No cameras, no notes, just 2 friends sharing injera and memories. "You did it," Nia said, dipping a piece of bread into spicy lentils. "You made them see." Zora shook her head. "I didn't make them see. They chose to look." "There's a difference," Nia smiled. "Maybe. But you held up the mirror." They talked about everything. The stress, the sleepless nights, the unexpected kindness from strangers. Zora admitted she'd cried once, alone in her hotel bathroom. Not from sadness, but from the sheer weight of being seen in a way that felt both exposing and healing. "And the white passenger?" Nia asked gently. "Has she said anything?" Zora shrugged. "Not a word. And honestly, I don't need her to. Her silence is part of the story too." Back home, Zora received an unexpected package. Inside was a framed print of a quote by Audre Lorde. "Your silence will not protect you." There was no return address, just a note. "For the next time you're asked to move." She hung it in her office right above her desk. Days later, she was invited to speak at a transportation equity forum, not as a victim but as a thought partner. She didn't give a speech full of blame. Instead, she talked about systems, about how bias isn't always loud or violent. It's often quiet, built into policies that seem neutral but play out unfairly. She spoke about the importance of listening to frontline workers, of centering the voices of those most affected. Afterward, a young woman approached her, eyes bright. "I work at an airport," she said. "I've seen things like this happen, but I never knew I could do anything." "What would you tell someone like me?" Zora thought for a moment. "Start by believing what you see. Then find one person you trust and say it out loud. That's how silence breaks." As she walked back to her car that night, the city lights shimmered around her. She felt tired, yes, but also lighter. Not because the problem was solved, but because she hadn't let it pass unnoticed. And somewhere on another flight, another passenger might be sitting in their rightful seat, unmoved, unbothered, unseen by the cameras but protected in part by the ripple Zora had set in motion. That, she thought, was enough. The weeks after the airline's announcement felt like watching a stone sink slowly through deep water, ripples spreading outward, some visible, others hidden beneath the surface. Zora Mbeki kept her head down, returning to the rhythm of her work. Site visits, budget reviews, late-night calls with engineers in Mississippi. But even in the quietest moments, she could feel the shift. Emails came in from unexpected places. A school district in New Orleans asking how to apply for solar grants. A community center in rural Alabama requesting a workshop. A young woman in Chicago writing to say she'd decided to study environmental justice after reading about Zora's story. She didn't mention the flight in any of her public talks. She didn't need to. People already knew. And what surprised her most wasn't the attention, it was the quiet solidarity. Strangers held doors a little longer. Colleagues listened more intently. At a conference in Denver, a hotel clerk recognized her and quietly upgraded her room. Just because you deserve it. Zora thanked her but asked that the upgrade go to someone else who might need it more. The clerk nodded, eyes soft. "You're the kind of person who makes people want to be better," she said. But while Zora moved forward, the airline was still untangling the knot it had tied itself. Internal investigations deepened. What started as a review of one flight turned into a full audit of customer service practices across all domestic routes. Former employees came forward, not just with stories of biased seat reassignments, but of training sessions where supervisors joked about managing the difficult ones while showing photos of black passengers. One whistleblower, a former gate agent named Tayana, submitted a 47-page log documenting dozens of similar incidents over 3 years. She'd kept it hidden in a password-protected folder, unsure if anyone would ever care enough to read it. Now, they did. The Department of Transportation released a preliminary report confirming a pattern of discriminatory practices. It didn't accuse the airline of intentional racism, legal language rarely goes that far, but it cited systemic failures in oversight, training and accountability that disproportionately impacted passengers of color. The findings were dry on paper, but their implications were seismic. For the first time, a major U.S. carrier faced potential federal penalties not for a mechanical failure or a safety violation, but for how it treated people based on how they looked. Stock prices dipped, shareholders grumbled. But something else happened too. Other airlines quietly updated their own policies. One competitor announced a new passenger equity pledge, banning discretionary seat changes unless both parties consented in writing. Another began publishing annual diversity reports for customer-facing staff. The industry, long resistant to scrutiny on these issues, was finally paying attention, not out of sudden morality, but because silence had become too costly. Back in Atlanta, Zora received a formal letter from the airline's legal team. It wasn't an apology, those had already been made, but an invitation. They wanted her to join a newly formed advisory council on passenger equity, alongside civil rights leaders, former flight crew, and community advocates. The group would help design the anti-bias training, review complaint procedures, and ensure changes weren't just performative. She almost said no. Part of her worried it would feel like co-opting, like they were using her name to soften a brand they'd damaged. But Nia reminded her, "You don't have to trust them to hold them accountable. And if you're at the table, you can make sure the changes actually stick." So Zora agreed, but with conditions. She wouldn't appear in their ads. She wouldn't endorse their New Era campaign. And she insisted the council include voices from communities most affected, not just polished professionals. They accepted. Her first meeting was held in a sunlit conference room at the airline's headquarters. Ironic, she thought, given how cold the place had felt just months before. Around the table sat a retired black pilot, a Latina flight attendant who'd filed a discrimination complaint 5 years prior, a disability rights advocate, and Tayana, the whistleblower, now working as a community organizer. No executives were allowed in the room unless invited. The power dynamic had flipped just slightly, but enough to matter. They didn't talk about branding. They talked about real things. how to train staff to recognize unconscious bias without making it feel like punishment, how to create anonymous reporting channels that passengers actually trust, how to measure whether changes lead to fewer complaints, or just fewer complaints being filed out of fear. Zora listened more than she spoke. But when she did, people leaned in. What if, she suggested one afternoon, every new hire had to spend a day shadowing someone from a community they've never served, not as a tourist but as a learner, sit in on a town hall in a rural town, visit a senior center where people rely on flights to see doctors, understand that a seat isn't just a seat, it's access, dignity, sometimes survival. The room fell quiet. Then Tayana nodded slowly. That's the kind of thing that changes hearts, not just handbooks. Meanwhile, the public hadn't forgotten. A documentary filmmaker reached out, not for a dramatic retelling, but for a short educational piece on transportation equity, something schools and training programs could use. Zora agreed, on the condition that Elias, the passenger who'd filmed the incident, be included. He saw it, she said. He chose to act. That's part of the story, too. Elias, it turned out, was a high school history teacher. He'd shown the video to his students, not to shame anyone, but to ask, what would you have done? And why does it matter? His classroom became a model for ethical bystander training. He even developed a lesson plan on civil rights in everyday spaces, airports, buses, waiting rooms. Zora visited his class one Friday morning. The students were sharp, thoughtful, unafraid to ask hard questions. One girl raised her hand and said, "Did you ever regret not making a bigger scene? Like yelling or refusing to move?" Zora smiled. "I used to wonder that too. But I realized my power wasn't in how loud I was, it was in how clear I stayed. Yelling might have gotten me removed from the plane, but staying calm let me make the call that changed everything." The room was silent for a beat. Then the girl nodded. So sometimes the quietest no is the loudest. Exactly, Zora thought. As spring turned to summer, the airline rolled out its new passenger rights charter. It was printed on every boarding pass, displayed in every gate area, and read aloud during safety briefings on select routes. It included clear language. Your assigned seat is yours. No passenger may be asked to move for another's comfort without voluntary consent. It also listed multiple ways to report unfair treatment, including a direct line to an independent. Ombudsman critics called it overdue. Supporters called it groundbreaking. Zora called it a beginning. She still flew, of course. Clean energy work demanded it. But now when she boarded, things felt different. Flight attendants greeted her by name, not because of the news, but because they'd been trained to see passengers as people, not problems. Once, on a red-eye to Phoenix, a young attendant leaned in and whispered, "My mom told me about your story." She said, "If you ever see someone being treated unfairly, speak up, even if your voice shakes." Then she handed Zora a blanket with a small, genuine smile. Zora wrapped it around her shoulders and closed her eyes. For the first time in a long time, she felt safe, not because she was famous, but because the system had finally started bending toward fairness, and that, more than any headline or policy change, was the real victory. Not perfection, not punishment, but progress, measured in small moments of respect, in choices made differently, in seats that stayed rightfully occupied, because change doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's the quiet click of a seatbelt staying fastened, exactly where it belongs. Time has a way of softening edges. What once felt like a storm becomes a story. What once burned with urgency settles into something quieter, still important but worn smooth by reflection. For Zora Mbeki, the flight that changed everything happened nearly a year ago, yet its echoes still showed up in unexpected places. In a student's thesis on transportation justice, in a new airline policy cited during a congressional hearing, in the way strangers sometimes paused before speaking to her, as if sensing she carried something deeper than just a suitcase. She never became famous in the way social media defines it. No viral dances, no brand deals, no late-night talk show appearances. But her name became shorthand for a kind of quiet courage, the kind that doesn't seek the spotlight but stands firm when it lands on you anyway. And that, she'd come to realize, was more than enough. Life had returned to its rhythm. The solar microgrids were now powering clinics, schools, and homes in 3 Mississippi towns. Children studied under LED lights after dark. Refrigerators kept vaccines cold during summer outages. Elders no longer had to choose between medicine and electricity. Zora visited each site regularly, not as a hero, but as a partner listening more than speaking, learning more than teaching. One humid afternoon in late summer, she sat on a porch in Rolling Fork, sipping sweet tea with Ms. Lula, a retired school teacher who'd become the local project coordinator. The air smelled of magnolias and rain. A ceiling fan creaked overhead. In the distance, solar panels glinted on the roof of the community center. "You ever think about that day on the plane?" Ms. Lula asked, fanning herself with a folded newspaper. Zora smiled. "Sometimes, but mostly I think about what came after." "Like this?" Ms. Lula gestured to the humming inverter box mounted on the wall. "Like this," Zora said, "and like the fact that my niece now tells her friends, if someone tries to move you, just say no and call Aunt Zora." They both laughed. But there was truth in it. The story had become part of her family's lore, not as trauma, but as a lesson in self-worth. Back in Atlanta, Zora's office had changed too. The Audre Lorde quote still hung above her desk, but now it shared space with new things. A handmade thank you card from a high school class in Detroit, a photo of the first solar-powered streetlight in one of the partner towns, and a small framed letter from a young woman named Tayana. Tayana had been the flight attendant who blew the whistle on the airline's pattern of biased practices. After leaving her job, she'd gone back to school and now worked with a non-profit that trained frontline service workers in anti-bias response. Her letter was short but powerful. "Because of you, I stopped believing I had to choose between my paycheck and my principles. Now I help others do the same." Zora kept that letter where she could see it every morning, not as a trophy but as a reminder. Real change isn't just about punishing the wrong, it's about empowering the right. The airline, for its part, had kept most of its promises. The passenger rights charter remained in place. Complaints about discriminatory treatment dropped by 62% in the first year. More importantly, internal surveys showed that frontline staff felt better equipped to handle difficult situations without resorting to bias. It wasn't perfect, no system ever is, but it was moving in the right direction. Zora still served on the advisory council, though her role had shifted. She no longer attended every meeting. Instead, she mentored younger advocates who'd taken her seat at the table. "Your job isn't to fix everything," she told them. "It's to make sure the next person doesn't have to start from scratch." One evening, she received an invitation she hadn't expected to speak at a national transportation summit, not as a victim of injustice, but as a leader in ethical design. The organizers wanted her to talk about how fairness could be built into systems from the start, not tacked on after harm was done. She accepted, but only if she could share the stage with Elias, the teacher who'd filmed the incident, and Tayana, the former crew member who'd risked her career to speak up. "This wasn't my story alone," she told the planners. "It belongs to everyone who chose to act." On the day of the event, the three of them stood together under soft stage lights. Elias spoke about teaching students to be ethical witnesses. Tayana talked about the cost and courage of truth-telling in workplaces that reward silence. And Zora spoke last. She didn't recount the flight in detail. Instead, she asked the audience a question. What if we stopped waiting for someone to be harmed before we build protection into the system? What if dignity wasn't a privilege for the right kind of passenger, but a baseline for everyone? The room was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, people began to clap, not out of politeness but recognition. Afterward, a man in his 60s approached her, eyes glistening. "My daughter was on a flight last month," he said. "A crew member asked her to move for someone else. She said no and cited your charter. They apologized and left her alone." He paused. "Thank you for making it possible for her to keep her seat without losing her voice." Zora squeezed his hand. "Thank you for raising her to use it." As the months passed, the story continued to ripple outward in ways no one could have predicted. A major university added the incident to its business ethics curriculum. A theater group in Chicago developed a short play based on the event, performed not for shock but for reflection. Even the white passenger from the flight, whose name never made the news, was rumored to have quietly donated to a racial equity fund. Though no one could confirm it, Zora didn't dwell on her. She'd made peace with the fact that not everyone would apologize and that healing didn't depend on it. What mattered more was the next generation. One Saturday morning, she volunteered at a youth leadership camp focused on civic engagement. A group of teenagers sat in a circle, discussing moments when they'd stood up for what was right. One girl, no older than 14, raised her hand. "I saw that video of you on the plane," she said. "I kept thinking, what if I'd been there? Would I have said something? Would I have filmed it like Elias did?" Zora leaned forward. "You don't have to wait for a plane to practice courage. It starts in the lunchroom, on the bus, in group chats. Every time you choose kindness over convenience, you're building the world we need." The girl nodded, thoughtful. Later, she handed Zora a small origami crane made from notebook paper. "For your desk," she said. "So you remember you're not alone." Zora placed it beside Tayana's letter. Now when she flies, she still prefers the window seat. But she no longer feels the need to brace H.